Gen Z is reshaping the retail workplace, but many employers are still figuring out how to engage and motivate this next generation. In this episode, our HR partner, People and Culture, share practical tips on what Gen Z really values at work and how to keep them motivated, and what retailers can do to build stronger, more connected teams. Kia ora, I'm Carolyn Young, Chief Executive of Retail NZ, and today I'm joined by Melanie Marks, who's the co-founder of People and Culture. Kia ora and welcome, Melanie.
Kia ora, Carolyn.
I know when we think about all of these generations, everyone's got a label, right? So a Gen Z, for all those business owners out there or managers that are unsure, it's someone that's born after 1997. So, turn of the century, those sort of young ones coming through, definitely not me. So, Melanie, what are the key differences that retailers should understand when managing Gen Z compared to other generations in the workforce? What's different about a Gen Z?
So the first thing I'd say that are the biggest difference is context. So a lot of Gen Zs have entered the workforce during an expensive, uncertain period. And some Deloitte research found that work-life balance is their top career goal. And given that the cost of living is part of one of their biggest concerns, living paycheck to paycheck, nearly half say they feel stressed or anxious most of the time. So when your Gen Z are asking more questions about hours, pay, flexibility, and progression, I don't necessarily see that as entitlement, that some people tend to use that word a bit with Gen Zs. I see it as a generation doing the math on whether the work is sustainable for them. I guess the second difference is that they want development to be visible. So earlier generations were sometimes willing to trust that if they worked hard, opportunity would eventually appear. But Gen Z is much more likely to ask, what can I learn here? Who will teach me? And what does the next step look like? And that is backed by research. So again, Deloitte found that learning and development is one of the top reasons that Gen Z choose an employer. And about half of managers want to teach and mentor them, but only a third say that is actually happening. So if you do want to engage Gen Z, don't just tell them there is opportunity, show them this next skill, the next responsibility, and the next possible role. And then the third thing I would say is we should stop assuming that because Gen Z is digitally fluent, that they want to be managed mainly through apps and messages. Some research that's found that Gen Z values face-to-face communication more than any other method. And 90% have said they have much stronger relationships with colleagues when they see them in person. So that tells me that old school retail strengths still matter. So pre-shift huddles, floor-based coaching, real-time feedback, and managers who are present and approachable. So I guess in simple terms, Gen Z need clearer management, not softer management. They want the context, the coaching, and genuine human connection.
And I guess to go back to one of those earlier points is that their aspirations may not be the same as what yours are. And most managers are often from a different generation, or maybe from a different generation. Certainly for small business owners, the business owner probably is. So your expectations are likely to be different. And so you have to try and put that aside in order to really understand the individual and work with the individual in these spaces.
Yes, definitely.
And so if we think about that, so what are some simple sort of practical ways that retail businesses could motivate and keep, those Gen Z team members engaged on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I'd break it into three things. So the roster, the relationship, and the roadmap. So starting with the roster, it's more important than employers realize. So for Gen Z, it's not just about getting enough hours. It's about knowing when they're working so they can plan the rest of their lives, because predictability really matters to them. Again, backed up by research, Randstad's employer brand research ranks work-life balance as the number one factor that people look for an employer. And MIMBY's research into young workers shows that uncertainty around hours and scheduling is one of their biggest workplace concerns. So one of the easiest things that retailers can do to improve engagement is simply provide more predictable rosters wherever possible. So put rosters out earlier, honour agreed availability where you can, explain changes to rosters clearly, and don't treat flexibility as a favour. So for a lot of Gen Z workers, that kind of certainty to hours rostered and worked is more motivating, it reduces stress for them. The second thing is the relationship with their direct manager. So, day to day, Gen Zs are motivated when they feel seen. So, that again means that quick coaching, quick recognition, and quick clarification. So, not just waiting for the once a year formal review. So, in the moment, if someone handled a customer brilliantly or solved a stock issue, say so specifically. The good news is that it doesn't take a complete management overhaul to do this. Regular coaching conversations, recognizing that good work, and giving feedback can make a huge difference. So, ultimately, building capability into your people leaders is one of the best investments you can make if you want to improve engagement and retention. And then the third way I think retail businesses can motivate and keep Gen Z team members engaged is the roadmap. So, constantly connecting today's job with tomorrow's options. So, I know Retail New Zealand's done some of their own research that shows there's still a perception problem and that people think retail is mainly shop floor work with limited career opportunity. But by actively showcasing those real pathways into management, marketing, buying, logistics, digital roles. So if I was advising a store, I'd say make progression visible. Let your young employees shadow another function, give them stretch tasks, and show them who in the business started on the floor and explain the skills they are building right now. When they can see that connection, their motivation engagement will really soar. And if I could add one more practical point, because it really matters in New Zealand, is be really clear about rights and expectations. So MIMBY found that 1 in 4 young workers don't think they understand their employment rights well, and web searches are now their top source for information on their rights. So a smart retailer doesn't want to wait for confusion or for an employee to do their own research from maybe a more negative perspective. If you're explaining breaks, leave, pay, training, who to ask for help, and how to raise concerns, that kind of clarity builds trust very quickly.
And look, employment legislation is exceedingly complicated, and the Holidays Act we know is really tricky to navigate. So they all make really perfect sense. It's all sort of common sense things that you would really probably want to do for any employee, regardless of whether they're Gen Z or any other generation. But if
Yes.
we think about, maybe what are some of the biggest mistakes that you might see retailers make with Gen Z staff, and how could they turn those mistakes around into a positive?
Yeah, sure. I think the first mistake is stereotyping. So if you've got a Gen Z asking why a lot, some managers might hear that as challenge or a bit of an attitude. But what they're really asking for is context and fairness. So Gen Z's grown up in a world where information is immediate and they're less likely to accept because that's how we do it as a complete answer. So a positive turnaround to all of those questions is a chance for you to actually build buy-in. So if you explain the why behind a target or a KPI, a roster decision or a policy, you usually get far more commitment. I think the second mistake is over promising on progression and under delivering on development. So, a lot of retailers might say there's growth available, but they can't actually see it or feel it in their first few months. So, I think one of the easiest things you can build in is kind of micro progression. So, a first 30-day plan, a 90-day plan. So, really clear milestones and small wins, maybe some cross training and feedback. So, if they can see movement, they'll stay engaged. If they can't, they might just assume there isn't a future there. The third mistake, I think, is, as mentioned earlier, relying too heavily on digital communication for important people conversations. So I think Gen Z still really value in person connection. So don't be managing performance or conflict through a flurry of messages. Use your digital tools for logistics, absolutely, but anything important, bring it back to a real conversation. So as mentioned, that can be your daily huddles or a walk and talk or a quick sit down after a hard shift.
And that applies to anyone, right, of any generation, really. We shouldn't be using email and digital formats of or texting for performance related things. So yes, it applies to Gen Z, but don't forget to make sure that you do those key conversations in person with all of your staff.
Yes. I think the final mistake is underestimating retail's own story. So, as mentioned, there's a belief out there in the market that retail is just a stopgap job, not a real career. But there are a huge range of roles in retail, and the New Zealand wage update points to an average wage well above minimum wage and a wide range of non-salary benefits. So there's a positive opportunity for retailers to tell better stories, to show the internal pathways, introduce young staff to leaders who started in store, make the invisible parts of retail visible, because once Gen Z see the bigger picture, they'll often become incredibly loyal contributors.
Look, that makes perfect sense. Don't forget that I think a lot of these tips apply to any of your staff as well as the Gen Zs. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today, Melanie, and to get some tips from people and culture about how we can engage and motivate Gen Z employees.
Yes, thanks, Carolyn, and we look forward to helping some of your members.
Look, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to visit People and Culture. That's people, A-N-D, culture.co.nz to find out more. This was part of our Empowering Retail series, your go-to resource for short, actionable insights to take your business to the next level. Don't forget to subscribe, but until next time, ka kite anō. Bye for now.